Today I wanted to show you some simple basic techniques when you're doing hand sewing. Maybe you haven't done it since you're in school or it's your first time doing it. First thing that I'm going to do is cut a length of thread. I'm doing it red thread on white just so that you can see. So thread your needle, and for your needle, the thicker the fabric, the thinner you'll want your needle to be so it goes through nice and easily. If you want to finish a seam, you don't want a raw edge, when you're sewing by hand, fold it over once, then fold it over again, iron it and press it down and sew along that seam. You might need to do 2 lines of stitching, but that's how you finish so you don't have any raw edges. Basics of hand stitching. The most secure stitch that you can do is a back stitch. Now, if you haven't hand sewn in a while, what I recommend doing is actually doing a line with a pencil, something that's going to rub out or wash out in the wash, so that you know what line to follow. Now, I'm actually going to do mine with a marker so that you can see it clearly. If you want, you can do it as a line, or you could also do it as a series of evenly spaced dots if you wanted to make sure you were getting exactly the right spacing on your stitches. So you could use your ruler to give you the stitch points. So that would be, I recommend maximum of about 5 mil for your stitches for hand stitching. First thing that I do is I tie a knot in the end of my thread. You can make it a double knot if you feel like it needs it, depending on the thickness of the thread you're using. I'm using quite a thick embroidery thread just for demonstration purposes on this. Now, you might want to pin your fabric together. So the first thing that I do is, some people like to have the knot coming out the back. I like to hide it inside my layers. So I'm just going to put it through one layer there. The knot will hold it in place. So a back stitch, we're going to do a stationary back stitch first to seal the first stitch. So go down into your fabric, keeping that tail there so you don't lose it. Okay, and then back up through that first stitch again, and back down again through the stitch beyond it. Do that 2 or 3 times to keep it nice and secure. So to do a back stitch, you go up. So I'm going to follow that line of marker that I've done. Go up beyond your last stitch, and then you go back into that last stitch. So there's no gaps. And go back down. This is a back stitch. Keep it nice and tight, but don't pull it too much. You want to make sure that you don't bunch your fabric. So you go up through your fabric, and then down through that last stitch. And if you want to go a little bit faster, I'll just show you a little method here. So go up through the fabric, then when you're coming down, you can go up at the same time, like that, okay? And I find actually that can sometimes help you keep your stitches a bit more even. See, up and down like that. And you stitch the entire way along like this. I'm going to do a few more stitches and then I'm going to show you how to finish off a line of hand stitching. Keeping your stitches as even as possible and along the same line. So like I say, having like a light line either in pencil or with one of those markers that can rub out or comes out with an iron or in the wash. I like to try and keep my stitches as small as possible because I think it makes the fabric more secure. All the way along. No gaps, remember, it's very important. Back into stitch. So this is called the back stitch. A running stitch is where you're just constantly going forward, and that's generally for embroidery or decorative stitching, where it's not the main structural element Make sure that your tail is not going to come through. Some people tie a knot here. I tend to try not to because it makes it's more fiddly when you're changing your thread over. Sometimes people also will use a double width or thickness of thread, so they'll double up their thread for hand stitching. I'm using an embroidery thread, so I wouldn't do it for this, but I'm just using the embroidery thread really for demonstration purposes. But I like to just use a single piece of thread for hand stitching. Now, coming to the end, so I'm going to do another stationary back stitch, and I'm going to go through that back stitch. Then I'm just going to come through one layer of my fabric and just do a tiny little stitch in there to hide that tail. Now, so if I turn this inside out, you'll see that's a really strong layer of stitching. Try and pull it apart. That's me pulling really hard and it's not possible. So you can see how hand stitching, when done correctly, can be as strong as machine stitching. Okay, most important things are even stitches, following a straight line, no gaps, and don't make your stitch length too wide.